众所周知，我们华人对于子女的教育是非常重视的，所以多伦多大学也有很多来自于中国的留学生。现在让我们听一听从移民二代 David 的角度来看移民二代和留学生的不同生活。
Now, the final thing I'll kind of talk about is just kind of my story and life growing up as a second-generation immigrant in Canada, and how that's kind of like different from a lot of the international students that I know of or I've met at my university. So growing up, my parents actually immigrated to Canada really, really early. So basically, my mom was pregnant on the plane when she arrived in Canada, and ever since that, I've actually we've moved around a lot, and we actually came from very, very like humble beginnings, I would say. We were like living in an apartment in Scarborough, but then eventually, as I got older, we were able to move around the city a bit more, and eventually ended up here studying downtown. What I would say is kind of like the differences between me and other kind of like international students. I think there's two things. The first is, I think, kind of the level of immersion we have within the culture within Canada is obviously a lot different. Growing up in Canada, I would say that I am first Canadian and then kind of second Chinese. I'm definitely a lot more comfortable speaking in English than in Chinese. And a lot of the culture which I grew up kind of living with and becoming familiar with is definitely distinctly more Canadian than I would say my parents' origins was just Chinese. So a lot of like kind of the Canadian culture that we're known for, things like, you know, maple syrup or poutine or like hockey night in Canada. These are cultural kind of like symbols that I'm a lot more familiar with, that I would say a lot of international students that, for example, study at our university would probably be very confused when they hear it for the first time. So I think that's definitely one part of it. I think the second and more important part of it is also just kind of my life growing up in Canada is distinctly different. And I don't want to generalize, but I think it's probably true that for a lot of international students, they definitely have to come from a lot more kind of privileged positions. The fact that, you know, it costs a lot to be able to study at the University of Toronto as an international student. Like, international tuition is probably somewhere between 2 and 3 times higher than the domestic tuition that I pay. And given that my family really kind of comes from that contrasting background, I think my mom and my dad have always been telling me stories about how, you know, when they first arrived to Canada, they were like working at like a Tim Hortons or something, and, you know, they had some very, very difficult times and a lot of challenges to overcome to be able to raise me and my sister, to be able to get to this position that we're in. And so I definitely feel very lucky and privileged to be able to have that sort of effort from my parents to be able to provide me with that sort of life today. But again, I would say that that kind of history and that kind of origin, as an immigrant, having to leave your home country and to face a new start and a new beginning in a country where you're very, very like unfamiliar with. You know, my mom and my dad had to learn English. They had to start from scratch because, you know, they did not know any English before moving here. That was very, very difficult, and those are just unique challenges that I think you face coming from an immigrant family that people who are kind of studying abroad are not going to necessarily face. And I think that that sort of experience is really unique, and I think also having gone through that and knowing my parents' story also probably makes me a lot more, you know, grateful for the opportunities I kind of have, and have really kind of shaped the way in which I look at like my time at university, I think, compared to like maybe an international student. So that's everything about me. Thank you so much for listening.